Cars are supposed to move people safely from point A to point B. Some, however, do the opposite. Some cars weren't just poorly engineered, they were death machines disguised as transportation. They were heavy on style, light on safety, and, in some cases, deliberately ignored warnings about their deadly flaws. These are 8 of the worst cars ever sold to Americans, vehicles that killed multiple people, often because the manufacturers valued profit, looks, or convenience over human life. Dear viewer, we have set a goal of reaching 30,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we would love for you to join us. Thank you for your support. Number 8. When Mercury introduced the Cougar in 1967, it was marketed as a luxury Mustang, a refined, more upscale alternative to Ford's wildly successful pony car. It promised style, comfort, and performance, combining muscle with elegance. But under the skin, the Cougar was still a Mustang in a fancier suit, and that meant it inherited all of the Mustang's engineering flaws: weak braking systems, crude steering, and no real crash protection. As speed climbed and safety expectations rose, the Cougar's flaws became deadly. The Cougar was built on the same Falcon-derived chassis as the Mustang, a platform that was cheap and outdated even by the late 1960s. The unibody construction lacked rigidity, flexing during hard cornering or emergency maneuvers. Engineers simply added sound insulation, chrome trim, and leather seats to make it luxury. Beneath the polish, it was still a budget car frame never designed for the power Mercury put into it. Result? The Cougar had a refined look, but when pushed hard, it twisted, shuddered, and lost control like its Mustang sibling. Drivers often praised the Cougar for its smooth cruising, but once speed increased, its flaws emerged sharply. Overly stiff steering made quick corrections nearly impossible. The front suspension geometry was crude, causing unpredictable handling at high speeds. The rear leaf spring suspension gave it a tendency to fishtail during sudden throttle lifts or braking. In emergency situations, a swerve or a hard stop, the car could easily slide sideways or spin out, a deadly problem on the open highway. The Cougar came with V8 engines ranging from 289 to 428 cubic inches, serious muscle for the era. But its drum brakes and even early disc options were woefully inadequate for the car's weight and speed potential. Brake fade was common after only a few hard stops. The rear drums often locked prematurely, throwing the car into skids. Under high heat, brake fluid could boil, leaving drivers with little to no stopping power. Accidents frequently occurred when Cougars overshot corners or intersections, simply because they couldn't stop in time. Like most cars of its era, the Cougar was built before the concept of crash engineering became standard. No crumple zones, the rigid front frame transmitted all impact forces straight to the cabin. No collapsible steering column. In a frontal crash, the steering shaft could impale the driver's chest. All metal dashboard, decorated with chrome edges that could lacerate occupants on impact. No seatbelt pretensioners or head restraints, leaving drivers vulnerable to whiplash and ejection. Many Cougars involved in high-speed crashes were completely unrecognizable afterward, their cabins crushed or torn open. Mercury's marketing sold the Cougar as the thinking man's muscle car, a blend of European sophistication and American power. Yet, the company spent far more on styling than on engineering. Hidden headlights, sequential turn signals, and plush interiors created an illusion of advancement. But behind the veneer, the same primitive chassis and safety void made it as hazardous as a base Mustang. The public loved the look until they discovered how easily it lost control at highway speeds. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, insurance companies flagged the Cougar for high fatality rates in rollover and frontal collisions, frequent single-vehicle crashes caused by oversteer or brake fade, severe occupant injury due to cabin collapse and steering wheel intrusion. In short, the Cougar looked like a luxury car, but performed like a barely tamed sports coupe, a combination that often ended in tragedy. By the time production of the first-generation Cougar ended in 1973, the world of automotive safety was changing. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, had begun enforcing crash standards. Collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards, and stronger door beams became mandatory. But for the early Cougars, especially the 1967 to 1970 models, those innovations came too late. They remain symbols of an era when style and performance sold cars, even if safety was ignored completely. The 1967 to 1973 Mercury Cougar stands as a tragic example of how luxury marketing masked mechanical danger. It offered chrome, comfort, and muscle, but behind the leather and wood trim lay a car that was unstable, under-braked, and unforgiving. Drivers seeking refinement found instead a high-speed liability, and countless Cougars met their end, wrapped around telephone poles or crushed in ditches. Luxury, after all, means nothing if the car can't keep you alive.
Number 7. In the 1960s, the Ford Galaxie 500 symbolized the American dream on 4 wheels, long, wide, and powered by big block V8s. It was the family car that could also burn rubber, a luxury cruiser that could hit 120 miles per hour on the new interstate highways. But underneath its sleek chrome and vast sheet metal, the Galaxie 500 was a rolling contradiction, massive yet fragile, powerful yet uncontrollable. Before crash safety laws, before anti-lock brakes, before crumple zones, the Galaxie was built for style and straight-line speed, not for survival. The result? One of the most deadly combinations of power and poor engineering ever to roll off Ford's assembly lines. The Galaxie 500 was enormous. By 1965, it tipped the scales at nearly 4,300 pounds. Ford's engineers bragged about its solid construction, but that weight became a curse in real-world driving. The nose-heavy chassis made the car understeer violently in corners. Body roll was extreme, especially at highway speeds. Drivers found that the car could plow straight ahead instead of turning, even with the wheel fully cranked. The sheer mass gave the illusion of safety, but in an emergency maneuver, a deer on the road, a sharp curve, or a sudden stop, the Galaxie behaved like a runaway freight train. Ford's steering design during this era was primitive and dangerous. The steering column was solid steel running directly into the driver's chest. There was no collapsible mechanism, meaning that in a frontal crash, the steering shaft shot backward like a spear. Even a moderate collision could drive the wheel through the driver's rib cage. It wasn't until the late 1960s that Ford began adopting energy-absorbing steering columns after years of fatal injuries and public pressure. Perhaps the Galaxie's most infamous flaw was its brake fade, the tendency of its all-drum braking system to lose effectiveness after repeated use. The car's heavy body and large V8 engines generated massive amounts of heat during braking. Drum brakes, unable to dissipate this heat, would expand and lose friction, causing a terrifying, long pedal feeling. Drivers often discovered too late that their brakes had all but vanished on long descents or after panic stops. Even Ford's later optional front discs couldn't fully solve the problem, as the rest of the braking system remained weak and poorly balanced. The Galaxy's massive dimensions and high center of gravity made it inherently unstable. When combined with its weak suspension and slow response steering, high-speed maneuvers were a recipe for disaster. Overcorrection after understeering often caused the rear end to swing violently, leading to rollovers. Once it began to roll, the roof structure collapsed easily, crushing passengers inside. The thin A-pillars and weak door frames provided virtually no rollover protection. Many fatal accidents involved the Galaxy veering off the road or flipping over entirely, its enormous weight turning it into a tumbling mass of steel. The 1960s were an era of illusion. Big cars meant big safety, or so the public was told. In truth, the Galaxy 500 was designed before modern crash physics were even considered. No crumple zones. The rigid ladder frame transmitted impact energy straight to occupants. Steel dashboards and steering wheels with chrome trim became deadly projectiles. Seatbelts were optional, and even when present, were lap-only with no shoulder restraint. When a Galaxy crashed, the structure didn't absorb energy. The people inside did. Ford's marketing played on the public's instinct that bigger means safer. Buyers believed that a full-size car like the Galaxy would protect their families better than smaller vehicles. But in reality, heavier cars transferred more momentum in a crash. The rigid frame didn't deform, amplifying forces on passengers. In multi-car collisions, smaller vehicles were often destroyed, but so were the people inside the Galaxy, crushed by their own car's lack of energy absorption. By the mid-1960s, traffic death data revealed that size didn't equal safety, especially when the car's design ignored basic crash dynamics. Throughout the decade, newspapers and safety advocates like Ralph Nader exposed the dangers of cars like the Galaxy. Police departments, which often used the Galaxy as a pursuit car, reported frequent brake fade, steering lockups, and high fatality rates among officers. Highway accident data from the era showed a disproportionate number of fatalities in Galaxy rollovers and frontal collisions, severe chest and head trauma from steering wheel and dashboard impacts, ejection deaths due to flimsy door latches and optional seatbelts rarely used. By 1968, the introduction of federal safety standards forced Ford to begin redesigning its steering columns, seatbelts, and roof supports, too late for thousands who had already perished. The Ford Galaxy 500 faded out by the end of the 1960s, replaced by safer, better engineered models like the LTD. But it remains a haunting reminder of the deadly arrogance of Detroit's big car obsession, when power and prestige outweighed the basic principle of human survival. Today, collectors prize the Galaxy for its style and V8 roar, but few realize how many lives were lost behind that steering wheel. The 1960 to 1968 Ford Galaxy 500 was a symbol of American excess and engineering blindness, a 2-ton missile that gave drivers speed without safety. It promised comfort, class, and confidence, yet delivered brake failure, steering spears, and rollovers. In an era that worshipped size, the Galaxy proved that bigger wasn't better, it was deadlier. Number 6. The Cadillac DeVille of the 1959-1969 decade stood as a monument to American luxury. Vast, powerful, and covered in chrome. It symbolized wealth and success, a rolling palace that made its drivers feel untouchable. But beneath the prestige and elegance lurked a terrifying truth. The DeVille was one of the most lethal cars of its time in a collision. It wasn't merely unsafe, it was a steel fortress with no forgiveness, designed in an era when luxury meant excess, not protection. Cadillac sold the dream of safety through size and prestige, but physics had other plans. During the 1950s and 1960s, automakers equated bigger with safer. Cadillac's DeVille embodied that idea perfectly. At nearly 19 feet long and weighing over 5,000 pounds, it dwarfed most cars on the road. But the engineering philosophy was primitive. No crumple zones. The body was built to resist bending, not absorb impact. Rigid frame construction meant that collision energy went straight to the occupants. In crashes, the passengers absorbed the impact, not the car. The result was catastrophic. In head-on collisions, the DeVille's massive steel frame didn't deform. It channeled the full force directly into the human body. Survivability was effectively zero at highway speeds. One of the deadliest features of the DeVille was its solid steel steering column. Until safety mandates arrived in the late 1960s, Cadillac used non-collapsible columns that extended directly toward the driver's chest. In frontal impacts, the steering shaft shot backward like a javelin, piercing or crushing the driver. Even moderate-speed crashes, 30 to 40 miles per hour, could drive the wheel deep into the torso. Cadillac's ornate steering wheels, with metal spokes and chrome horn rings, amplified the trauma, turning decoration into deadly shrapnel. Luxury didn't save lives. It made injuries more gruesome. Step inside a 1960s DeVille and you're greeted with polished metal trim, gleaming dials, and a solid dashboard that feels indestructible. Unfortunately, it was indestructible, and that's exactly what made it so deadly. The dash was made of solid cast metal with sharp edges and no padding. In a collision, heads and chests slammed into it with bone-shattering force. There were no airbags, and seatbelts were optional or rarely used. Passengers didn't survive high-speed frontal impacts. They were thrown forward into steel and chrome that never gave an inch. Cadillac's interiors were renowned for their plushness and space, but those wide, overstuffed bench seats and rigid seatbacks became weapons in a crash. The seats were bolted directly to the rigid floor, transmitting crash energy straight into passengers' spines. Seat frames were solid steel bars covered with minimal cushioning. During violent impacts, these frames fractured ribs, crushed organs, and caused massive internal injuries. Even rear seat passengers weren't safe. The unrestrained mass of their own bodies often catapulted them forward, striking the front passengers or dashboard with deadly force. Driving a DeVille fast was like piloting a battleship on roller skates. Drum brakes on all four wheels were standard through most of the 1960s. After only a few hard stops, they overheated and faded almost completely. In emergencies, the car simply wouldn't stop in time. Steering was vague and over-assisted, requiring multiple turns of the wheel just to change direction. Body roll was enormous, meaning sudden maneuvers often led to catastrophic loss of control. At highway speeds, a tire blowout or sharp curve could send a DeVille skidding sideways into oncoming traffic or rolling over entirely. Cadillac's enormous V8 engines, some displacing over 472 cubic inches, generated tremendous heat. Unfortunately, the engine bay and fuel systems weren't designed with containment in mind. Fuel lines often ruptured in crashes, spilling gasoline near hot exhaust manifolds. The rear-mounted gas tank was poorly shielded, easily punctured in rear impacts. Several fatal accidents ended not from impact alone, but from post-crash fires that consumed the cabin within seconds. Cadillac's silence on the matter was deafening.
As long as the cars sold, the dangers remained unspoken. Cadillac's marketing was masterful. Their ads declared the DeVille a sanctuary of strength, a car so solid that drivers supposedly didn't need modern safety equipment. But data from insurance companies and accident reports painted a grim reality. Drivers of Cadillacs were no safer than those in smaller cars, and often worse off in head-on collisions. The DeVille's rigid frame caused fatal internal injuries even in survivable crashes. Pedestrians struck by DeVille's rarely survived. The front end was high, heavy, and unyielding. Luxury wasn't protection. It was a facade of comfort masking a complete lack of engineering foresight. By the late 1960s, the tide began to shift. Public outrage, sparked by Ralph Nader's 1965 exposé, Unsafe at Any Speed, forced the auto industry to act. In response, Cadillac introduced energy-absorbing steering columns, 1967, padded dashboards and recessed knobs, collapsible frames and improved door locks. But these came too late for the early DeVille generation. Thousands had already perished in fiery, crushing wrecks. The elegant DeVille had proven that prestige could be deadly when paired with ignorance. Today, the 1959-1969 Cadillac DeVille stands as a paradox. Collectors adore its flamboyant tail fins, sweeping lines, and V8 thunder. But historians and safety experts recognize it for what it truly was, a 2.5-ton death trap of American arrogance. Its design philosophy, rigidity equals strength, directly contradicted everything we now know about crash safety. It was built to survive impacts as a machine, but not to preserve human life. It was, quite literally, a coffin of comfort, beautifully built, fatally designed.
Number 5. When people think of the Plymouth Fury, they often picture the possessed Red 58 from Stephen King's Christine, a supernatural killer. But the truth is that the Fury didn't need any dark magic to be dangerous. Between 1956 and 1970, Plymouth's sporty, full-size coupe was a rolling hazard that earned its reputation not from fiction, but from physics and flawed engineering. The Fury began life in 1956 as Plymouth's attempt to compete with Chevrolet's Bel Air and Ford's Fairlane in the performance luxury market. It was meant to be a prestige model, but Plymouth engineers didn't reinforce or redesign the chassis to handle its increased speed and weight. Instead, they simply bolted a more powerful V8 engine onto an existing lightweight frame, and the results were disastrous. Chassis rigidity, minimal. The frame flexed under load, causing alignment and steering issues. Weight distribution, heavily front-biased, making the rear end unstable at speed. Braking system, all drum brakes that overheated within minutes of hard use. By the late 1950s, Plymouth had fully embraced the forward look styling trend with massive tail fins and extended rear overhangs. But all that flash hid a terrifying truth. The Fury had one of the most unpredictable rear suspensions of its era. The leaf spring rear setup and soft dampers created a floaty ride, but offered zero stability in sharp turns. At highway speeds, the rear tires would often lose traction first, sending the car into uncontrolled spins. In wet or icy conditions, the Fury behaved like it was driving on ball bearings. Even professional test drivers of the day called it the wildest rear end in Detroit. Adding to the chaos was the Fury's slow and heavy steering system. Many drivers reported that the steering wheel required several full turns to respond, by which time it was often too late. There was no power steering in early models, and later ones had overly boosted systems that made control vague at high speeds. The result? Overcorrection and loss of control. When a car began fishtailing at 60+ mph, the driver had almost no chance to recover. Accident records from the late 1950s and early 1960s often list loss of control as the primary cause in Fury wrecks. As Detroit approached the 60s, muscle car, studded with chrome and powered by monster V8s, was vying to dominate the performance luxury market. Plymouth had rushed to join the competition with the Fury in 1956, but later models were confusing mixed bags of shiny and dangerous elements that never came together. By the late 1950s, Plymouth had fully embraced the forward-look styling trend with massive tail fins and extended rear overhangs. But all that flash hid a terrifying truth. The Fury had one of the most unpredictable rear suspensions of its era. The leaf spring rear setup and soft dampers created a floaty ride but offered zero stability in sharp turns. At highway speeds, the rear tires would often lose traction first, sending the car into uncontrolled spins. In wet or icy conditions, the Fury behaved like it was driving on ball bearings. Even professional test drivers of the day called it the wildest rear end in Detroit. Adding to the chaos was the Fury's slow and heavy steering system. Many drivers reported that the steering wheel required several full turns to respond, by which time it was often too late. There was no power steering in early models, and later ones had overly boosted systems that made control vague at high speeds. The result? Overcorrection and loss of control. When a car began fishtailing at 60+ mph, the driver had almost no chance to recover. Accident records from the late 1950s and early 1960s often list loss of control as the primary cause in Fury wrecks. Detroit anticipated the coming of the muscle car, studded with chrome and powered by monster V8s, was increasingly dominating the performance luxury market. In this changing landscape, Plymouth feared that the previously successful Fury would become outdated. The Fury continued using drum brakes well into the late 1960s. On paper, they were adequate. In reality, they were lethal. Brake fade. After 2 or 3 hard stops, braking power would drop by 50%. Uneven pressure. The drums would heat unevenly, pulling the car violently to one side. Emergency stops. Nearly impossible without skidding. The Fury could accelerate like a muscle car, but it couldn't stop like one. Even though it was marketed as a prestige performance car, the Fury had no meaningful safety engineering. The body-on-frame design was rigid, but not in a protective way. It simply transferred all impact energy directly to passengers. Steering column, solid, non-collapsible. It could, and often did, impale drivers in frontal crashes. Dashboard, hard metal with chrome trim, turning into shrapnel on impact. Seat mounts, weak, often ripping free during collisions, launching occupants forward. In rollover accidents, the Fury's roof pillars collapsed easily, flattening the cabin and killing occupants instantly. When Christine hit theaters in 1983, it made the 1958 Fury famous for all the wrong reasons. But automotive historians pointed out that the movie's horror was rooted in truth. In the late 50s, Furies were involved in a disproportionately high number of fatal crashes compared to other full-size Plymouths. Their combination of speed, poor handling, and no safety features turned them into a real-world death trap long before Hollywood noticed. By the late 1960s, the Fury nameplate had expanded into a whole lineup: Fury, I, 2, 3, Sport Fury, but the quality didn't improve. The larger models of 1965 to 1970 were even heavier, yet still used archaic suspension setups and inadequate brakes. At high speed, the Fury understeered horribly, a frightening contrast to its earlier tail-happy nature. Either way, it spelled disaster. Number 4. The Ford LTD, introduced in 1965, was marketed as a luxury car for the common man. It offered chrome, comfort, and a quiet ride, everything suburban America wanted. But beneath its elegant veneer, the LTD was a death trap wrapped in steel and vinyl. It was massive, heavy, and rigid, yet those very traits made it catastrophic in collisions. Unlike today's cars with crumple zones and energy-absorbing steering columns, the LTD transmitted the full force of any crash directly to the people inside. The tragic irony, it crushed everything it hit, including its own occupants. In the 1960s, the American car industry believed that size equaled safety. The Ford LTD embodied this philosophy. Weight, 4,000 pounds in most configurations. Frame, heavy-duty body-on-frame construction. Steel thickness up to double that of compact cars of the era. On paper, that looked impressive. In reality, it meant that during a crash, the car didn't absorb impact energy, the passengers did. There were no engineered deformation zones, and the rigid frame acted like a hammer. When the LTD hit something, it didn't crumple, it stopped abruptly, while everything inside kept moving at 60 miles per hour. The most infamous flaw of the Ford LTD was its non-collapsible steering column, a solid metal shaft directly connected from the steering wheel to the steering gearbox. In head-on collisions, the steering column drove straight toward the driver, acting like a spear. The force of the driver's body against the wheel often impaled the chest or punctured the lungs. Ford did not introduce collapsible columns until the late 1960s, after years of fatal injuries and lawsuits. Crash investigators in the late 1960s frequently noted that LTD fatalities involved massive chest trauma and impalement injuries, even at moderate speeds. Seatbelts became optional in the mid-1960s, but early systems in the LTD were poorly engineered and dangerously unreliable. Anchor bolts were attached to thin sheet metal that tore loose in high-impact collisions. Some belts used flimsy latch plates that released under load. The seat tracks themselves could shear away from the floor, launching occupants forward. In crash reconstructions from the 1960s, investigators routinely found LTDs where the belts remained buckled, but the anchors had ripped free from the car's body. Survivors of frontal impacts were extraordinarily rare. The phrase seatbelt failure became shorthand among emergency responders for the LTD. Luxury in the 1960s meant hard surfaces and shiny trim, not safety padding. The LTD's cabin was lined with rigid metal, heavy knobs, and chrome ornaments. During a crash, the metal dashboard became a blunt force weapon. Steel knobs and radio dials broke bones or punctured skin. The windshield lacked lamination in early models, shattering into razor-like shards. Even minor accidents often resulted in deep lacerations, concussions, and facial disfigurement. It wasn't until the early 1970s that Ford began using padded dashboards and recessed knobs, by which time thousands of injuries had already occurred. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, "The LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it." Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. Despite its massive presence, the LTD handled like a ship at sea. Power steering was vague and overboosted. Drum brakes faded rapidly after a few stops. Body roll was so extreme that sudden swerves could lead to rollovers or complete loss of control. At highway speeds, the car's weight worked against it. When momentum built, stopping distances exceeded 200 feet, a nightmare in emergency situations. In the words of one 1967 Consumer Reports test driver, the LTD gives you the illusion of control until you actually need it. By the early 1970s, safety research led by the National Highway Safety Administration exposed the fatal weaknesses of cars like the LTD. Crash tests revealed steering column intrusion of up to 12 inches into the driver's space, seatbelt anchor tear-out during 30-mile-per-hour barrier tests, roof crush far exceeding survivable limits. These results helped push federal safety standards that banned non-collapsible steering shafts, required seatbelt reinforcement, and mandated energy-absorbing dashboards. But for many drivers in the 1960s and early 1970s, those reforms came too late. The Ford LTD remains a symbol of an era when luxury and mass were mistaken for safety. It was marketed to the American middle class as a car that would protect their families, but in reality, it killed them with the same force it protected them from. It didn't crumple, it didn't absorb, it didn't give, it crushed. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling truth about the LTD. It was too strong for its own good and too deadly for anyone's safety. Years built: 1965-1978. Fatal flaws: rigid frame, solid steering column, seatbelt anchor failure, poor roof strength. Handling issues: massive understeer, brake fade, rollover tendency. Reputation. Number 3. The Dodge Charger, first introduced in 1966, was the perfect expression of the American muscle car dream. Long, low, sleek, and brutally fast. It looked like a predator on wheels, with engines that could roar past 130 miles per hour. But what Chrysler engineers created in beauty and power, they failed to match in balance, safety, and control. The Charger became infamous for its deadly weight distribution, poor braking, and catastrophic rollover record. Its power came at the price of stability, and for thousands of drivers, that cost was fatal. When the Charger debuted in 1966, it was marketed as a fastback luxury coupe, combining the performance of a race car with the comfort of a family vehicle. Buyers could choose engines like the 318 V8, modest by muscle standards; the 383 Magnum, offering serious punch; the infamous 426 Hemi or 440 Magnum, capable of brutal acceleration. But Dodge engineers built the car on Chrysler's B-body platform, which was never designed for high-speed stability. It was meant for family sedans, not for the physics of 425 horsepower. The Charger's biggest killer wasn't under the hood, it was beneath the body. Nearly 60% of its weight sat over the front wheels, due to the huge cast-iron engine block and heavy front suspension. That imbalance created 3 deadly tendencies. Understeer at high speeds, the car refused to turn when the driver needed it most. Snap oversteer when braking mid-corner, the rear end swung around uncontrollably. Complete instability on wet or uneven pavement. At highway speeds, a sudden correction could send the Charger into a spin so fast that even experienced drivers couldn't recover. Police accident reports from the late 1960s are filled with notes like "lost control on curve," "vehicle overturned," or "driver ejected." It looked like aerodynamic, but it wasn't. The Charger's sweeping fastback roofline created rear-end lift at speeds above 80 miles per hour, making the tail light and unstable. Wind tunnel tests, conducted later in the 1970s, showed that early Chargers generated more lift than downforce, meaning the faster you went, the less traction you had. Combine that with bias-ply tires and sloppy 1960s steering systems, and you had a recipe for high-speed disaster. Many muscle car deaths of the era were single-vehicle accidents, where the Charger simply spun off the road and rolled. One of the Charger's greatest visual strengths, its low, sloping roofline, was also its most fatal weakness. The A and B pillars were thin, made for looks, not strength. In rollover crashes, the roof collapsed almost instantly. The fastback design acted like a ramp, helping the car flip instead of slide. Crash investigators noted that the entire roof could flatten down to the seat level, crushing anyone inside. Seatbelts, if worn at all, offered no protection from the collapsing roof. In one notorious 1969 highway rollover study in California, the Charger was cited as having catastrophic roof collapse at first contact, a structural collapse unmatched even by other muscle cars. The Charger's brakes were barely adequate for a 200-horsepower sedan, let alone a 425-horsepower monster. Most models came with drum brakes on all four wheels, prone to fading and overheating. Repeated hard stops could boil brake fluid, causing pedal loss. Even optional front disc brakes, added later, weren't ventilated, meaning fade was still deadly. At 100 miles per hour, stopping distances exceeded 400 feet, longer than a football field. When panic braking met poor traction and uneven weight balance, the Charger didn't just stop, it spun, flipped, or plowed through obstacles. By the late 1960s, state highway patrols in California, Texas, and Michigan were reporting high fatality rates among Charger drivers. Insurance companies noticed too. Premiums skyrocketed for drivers under 30. One 1969 Highway Safety Digest report noted that the Charger had double the national average for single-vehicle fatalities. One of the worst roof crush scores in field accident data. Frequent ejection cases as doors and latches flew open during rollovers. It wasn't just reckless youth behind the wheel, it was a lethal combination of flawed physics and bad engineering. Inside the Charger, luxury came before safety. There were no headrests, no energy-absorbing steering columns, and no padded dashboards in early models. When an impact occurred, the steering wheel drove straight into the driver's chest. The metal dash shattered knees and faces. The doors popped open, throwing passengers onto the pavement. Seat belts, though optional, were often unused, and even when buckled, they anchored to thin sheet metal that tore away on impact. Survivability in rollovers or high-speed head-ons was near zero. Hollywood didn't help. Films like Bullitt, 1968, and Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, 1974, glorified the Charger as a fearless outlaw's machine, powerful, invincible, unstoppable. But reality was different. The car that looked indestructible on screen was fragile where it mattered most. Police and coroners in the 1960s and 70s had another name for it: the coffin with a carburetor. Today, the 1966 to 1971 Dodge Charger is a collector's dream, a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and raw horsepower. But in its prime, it was also a lethal executioner of the very people who loved it most. Its seductive looks and thunderous engines blinded buyers to the truth. It was a machine of unforgiving physics. One mistake, one swerve, one brake too late, one patch of wet asphalt, and the Charger turned from muscle to metal coffin. It stands today as a sobering lesson in automotive history. Years built, 1966 to 1971. Fatal flaws: poor weight balance, roof collapse, rear end lift at high speed, brake fade. Accident patterns: rollover crashes, loss of control, ejection. Public reputation: iconic but deadly. Insurance nightmare of the late 1960s. Lesson learned: power and style can't save you when physics turns against you. Number 2. The 1973 to 1977 Chevrolet Malibu was meant to symbolize a new era of practicality. Smaller than the full-size Impala, yet large enough for American families who still wanted comfort and power. It was part of GM's response to changing markets and rising insurance rates, offering safe, sensible, efficient transportation. But under that promise lay a grim reality. The Malibu quickly gained a reputation among safety engineers and crash investigators as one of the most dangerous mid-size cars of its time, not because it was fast, but because it failed catastrophically in real-world crashes. The combination of weak body engineering, unstable handling, and fuel system failures made it a tragic example of how Detroit's cost-cutting and styling priorities endangered lives. In 1973, GM introduced its new Colonnade A-body cars, the Chevrolet Malibu, Pontiac Le Mans, Oldsmobile Cutlass and Buick Century. These shared platforms were designed for more crash protection, on paper, a smoother ride, and compliance with new federal safety and emission standards. But the actual results were the opposite. To reduce production costs and increase profit margins, Chevrolet reused weakened subframes and lightened rear structures, leaving the Malibu structurally unbalanced and dangerously brittle in collisions. While GM's marketing touted the Malibu as strong and secure, independent crash data told another story. The Malibu folded like tin foil in even moderate rear-end impacts. Perhaps the most infamous flaw of the 1973 to 1977 Malibu was its rear-end crash performance. The fuel tank was mounted vertically behind the rear axle, between the trunk and the bumper. In a collision over 30 miles per hour, the trunk floor buckled, driving the metal tank forward into the rear seat area. When the tank ruptured, spilled gasoline often ignited from sparks or hot exhaust components. Crash tests conducted by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and later independent studies revealed horrifying footage. The Malibu's rear end folded completely, with flames engulfing the cabin in seconds. In fact, the Malibu's fuel tank configuration was similar to the one that led to the Ford Pinto fire scandal, yet it received far less public attention. The phrase, "the Malibu burns faster," began circulating among crash investigators in the mid-1970s. Chevrolet engineers designed the Malibu suspension to prioritize comfort and cost savings, not safety or precision. The soft coil springs and underdamped shocks caused excessive body roll. The rear suspension geometry was poorly tuned, creating lift throttle oversteer. The front heavy weight distribution, especially with V8 engines, made it understeer at high speeds and oversteer unpredictably in quick corrections. In emergency maneuvers, such as swerving to avoid an obstacle, the Malibu often fishtailed violently or lost rear traction completely. Highway patrol reports from 1975 to 1977 showed that Malibus were disproportionately involved in single-vehicle crashes, spinouts, rollover collapse, and ejections triggered by loss of control. Despite advertising energy-absorbing design, the Malibu's cabin integrity was shockingly poor. Crash data showed the roof crushed easily in rollovers, the front cowl and firewall intruded into the passenger compartment during frontal impacts, door latches often failed on side impacts, ejecting passengers. The steering column was still a semi-rigid shaft that could impale the driver. One internal GM safety memo from 1974 reportedly described the Malibu's cabin rigidity as critically insufficient for rear impact survivability. In other words, the Malibu looked like a family car, but structurally it was a death trap at freeway speeds. By the mid-1970s, reports of rear impact fires involving the Chevrolet Malibu began to surface across the U.S. Families reported being trapped in burning cars after being rear-ended, often with fatal outcomes. The most infamous case came in 1979, when Anderson versus GM brought the issue to court. The plaintiffs argued that GM knowingly sold Malibus with a defective and explosive fuel system. Evidence presented showed that GM could have fixed the problem with a simple $2 shield plate between the tank and the bumper, but chose not to save money. The court eventually ordered GM to pay $4.9 billion in damages, one of the largest automotive verdicts in history, though later reduced on appeal. The case exposed a chilling truth. GM had conducted crash tests proving the danger and buried the results. What made the Malibu tragedy especially cruel was its target audience. This wasn't a high-performance muscle car or a reckless street racer. It was a family sedan, driven by parents with children, by working people who trusted Chevrolet's name. But when those cars were struck from behind, even at city speeds, the result was often an explosion or instant cabin collapse. Survivors described scenes of fire, melted dashboards, and trapped passengers unable to escape through jammed doors. The Malibu became an unspoken symbol of the 1970s American auto safety crisis, when image, comfort, and corporate profits came before basic survivability. Beyond crash safety, the Malibu also had dangerous braking behavior. The rear drums overheated easily, and the front discs, if equipped, offered little ventilation. In mountain driving or stop-and-go traffic, fade could occur after just a few hard stops, turning the brake pedal spongy or useless. Combined with the car's tendency to nosedive under braking, this made it nearly impossible to stop safely in emergencies. Drivers often reported that the Malibu pulled violently to one side when braking at highway speeds, a symptom of its inconsistent front suspension geometry. Chevrolet's advertising during the 1970s called the Malibu America's most trusted midsize. But those same marketing images, clean suburban streets, happy families, stood in painful contrast to the grim outcomes on America's highways. Underneath the chrome and vinyl was a vehicle engineered to fail catastrophically under the very conditions that define real-world safety: collisions, heat, and control loss. It wasn't that the Malibu was fast, it was that it didn't protect anyone when things went wrong. Though overshadowed by the Pinto scandal, the Malibu played a major role in pushing fuel system integrity standards forward. After multiple lawsuits and crash tests exposed the car's hazards, federal regulators forced automakers to reinforce fuel tanks against rupture, improve rear impact crash protection, and install more effective trunk floor barriers between tank and cabin. By the early 1980s, GM finally redesigned the Malibu with a safer frame and tank placement, but the damage to its reputation was already done. Production years: 1973 to 1977. Fatal flaws: weak rear frame, exploding fuel tank, unstable handling, cabin collapse, brake fade. Common accident types: rear-end fires, spinouts, rollover collapse, ejections. Legal history: subject of the Anderson versus GM fuel fire lawsuit, $4.9 billion verdict. Lesson: cost-cutting and comfort mean nothing when a 30 miles per hour hit can ignite an inferno. The Chevrolet Malibu of 1973 to 1977 was proof that safety can't be faked with advertising slogans or chrome trim. It was a car that looked ordinary, but behind its polite midsize image hid one of the most dangerous fuel and crash designs of its era. It was, in every sense, a midsize menace, one that burned faster than it ever drove.
Number 1. The Pontiac Firebird was introduced in 1967 as Pontiac's answer to the Ford Mustang, a sleek, performance-oriented pony car designed to appeal to young, speed-hungry buyers. Aggressive styling, long hood, short deck, optional high-output V8s, signature Trans Am additions. It quickly became a symbol of American muscle. But behind the style and roaring engines lay a dangerous combination of design flaws. Unlike its sibling, the Mustang, the Firebird's engineering made it more likely to kill its drivers in routine accidents than to win races. The Firebird's long front overhang and relatively short rear made it prone to rear-heavy handling at high speeds. When accelerating hard or cornering, the rear tires often lost grip, causing the car to fishtail. The swing axle and live rear axle designs in early models amplified oversteer tendencies.
Sudden lane changes or emergency maneuvers could easily send the Firebird into uncontrollable spins, often resulting in rollovers. Police reports from the 1970s frequently cited young drivers losing control of Firebirds on highways, leading to fatal crashes. The Firebird's fuel tank placement compounded the danger. Positioned close to the rear axle, the tank could be punctured in rear-end collisions, especially with V8-powered models that often traveled faster than ordinary sedans. Leaked fuel frequently ignited from sparks, hot exhausts, or metal-on-metal contact, creating post-crash fires. The irony was tragic. A car named after a fire spirit often literally burned its occupants after impact. Fire investigations from the era show a disproportionate number of Firebirds in rear-end collisions ending in flames, rivaling other notorious cars like the Chevrolet Malibu and AMC Gremlin. While the Firebird could reach 0 to 60 miles per hour quickly, its stopping power often lagged behind. Early models had front disc brakes but rear drums, leading to brake fade during repeated hard stops. Suspension geometry prioritized style and a smooth ride over stability. At high speeds, braking or swerving could result in oversteer, sending the car into ditches or rollovers. Test data and insurance loss records from 1967 to 1972 showed that Firebirds were more likely than comparable Mustangs to be involved in single-car accidents with serious injuries. The Firebird appealed to young, inexperienced drivers, a demographic statistically more likely to take risks. Combine that with a powerful V8 under the hood, twitchy rear-end dynamics, fuel system prone to post-crash fires, and the result was a car that killed both in motion and after collision. Highway patrol bulletins from Michigan, Ohio, and California report dozens of fatalities per year linked to uncontrolled spins and rear-end fuel fires in early Firebirds. It wasn't just speed, it was design and physics conspiring against survival. The Firebird was built before federal crash safety mandates like seatbelt pretensioners or energy-absorbing steering columns. Lap belts only in most models. Rigid steering column and metal dashboard. Doors without side impact reinforcements. In collisions, these features or lack thereof amplified injuries even at moderate speeds. Survivors often reported ejection or being trapped in deformed interiors. Pontiac branded the car the Firebird to evoke speed, power, and untamed spirit. But in reality, speed became a hazard due to unstable handling. Rear-end collisions often caused fire. Drivers were unprotected in even minor crashes. The Firebird's mythic name became a tragic irony, symbolizing the very dangers it posed on American roads. By 1979, improvements were made. Rear suspensions were reinforced and stabilized. Fuel tanks were better protected. Disc brakes became standard on higher trims. Yet the Firebird's early reputation for crashes and fire persisted, a reminder of how styling and performance can overshadow basic safety. Insurance records continued to classify early Firebirds as high-risk vehicles, influencing teen and young adult driver insurance premiums for years. Rear-heavy, twitchy suspension led to spinouts and rollovers. Fuel tank vulnerability led to post-crash fires. Weak braking and handling led to loss of control. Primitive crash protection led to severe injuries and fatalities. Human impact, thousands of highway deaths and burn injuries disproportionately affecting young drivers. The Pontiac Firebird was beautiful, fast, and aspirational, but it taught a dark lesson. Muscle car glamour cannot substitute for engineering foresight. A car that promised flame and flight too often delivered fire and fatality instead.